Hi there, thanks so much for joining us for Boot Camp Part 4. This time we're going to look at what happens when God's people finally enter the land of Canaan, how they fail to be the holy nation that God called them to be, and how God offers hope through two very significant births. This section of the story is covered in the books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel. So let's get right into it.
So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with 4 main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites, and so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. Judges tells the story of Israel's total failure. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. This part of Israel's history was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again and it would all start over. It's very disturbing. And that's the point. These stories are meant to serve as a warning. Israel's descent into self-destruction is the result of turning away from the God who loves them and saved them out of slavery in Egypt. And now Israel needs to be delivered again from themselves.
So God's people are descending into utter chaos, but in the middle of it, God is at work. And we're told of 2 very important births. The first is in the first part of 1 Samuel, chapters 1 to 7. So let's have a look at that.
We're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son named Samuel. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people.
The second significant birth is in the book of Ruth. And it's an amazing story of how one family from God's people leaves God's care and protection, leaves the land he promised, trying to look after themselves by going to hated Moab. And there, all of the men of the family die, and that leaves only the elderly Naomi and her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law as widows. So whilst the 2 girls have a chance to get new husbands and rebuild their lives, Naomi realizes her best shot is to go back to Israel. But Ruth decides to commit herself to the God of Israel and determines to stick with Naomi. And the book tells how God intervenes in a miraculous way, not only to restore their lives, but to bring into the world through Ruth a child who would be the father of Jesse, who would be the father of David. And David, as we'll find out in the next section, turns out to be absolutely key in God's salvation plan for a world that constantly rejects his rule, protection, and blessing.